Welcome to Good Grief, the podcast where resilience meets reality. I'm your host, Dr. Christine Malone. In this podcast, we delve deep into the stories of individuals who've triumphed over tragedy, adversity, and trauma. In every episode, we bring you raw and honest narratives from guests who faced life's most challenging moments head on. Through candid conversations, they share their journeys of resilience, shedding light on the strategies, mindset shifts, and support systems that empowered them to rise above their darkest hours. Join us as we explore the profound depths of human resilience and discover how, even in the face of life's toughest trials, there can be light, growth, and yes, good grief. Okay, listeners, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. My guest is historian and former tech CEO, Ron Gruner. He's going to discuss with us his upcoming book that's out now called COVID Wars, America's Struggle Over Public Health and Personal Freedom. So, Ronald, thank you so much for joining us today. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation, and be happy to chat a bit about myself. I'll start with where I was born. I was born in a small town in Oklahoma called Parker City, and fell in love with computers in high school. I was a winner in the state high school science fair and in computers, and wound up moving to Massachusetts when I was 20 to work in the computer business. And I spent 40 years working in high technology, or big tech, they call it now. We call it high technology. It sounded almost religious back in the 60s and 70s. But I spent 40 years in technology. Much of that was involved running my own companies. I started 3 companies: Alliant Computer Systems, Sheridan.com, and Sky Analytics. And so the first went public, and the second 2 I sold successfully. So I have an engineering background, but I retired in 2015. I'm going to be 78 years old, which I can't believe myself, just in a couple of months, July 14th, which is also, by coincidence, Bastille Day, as many people might know.
Mhm.
But I got bored with retirement. My wife and I moved to Naples, Florida, and I found out very quickly I'm a pathetic golfer, so I'm not going to make it as a golfer in retirement. So I had to take something else up. And I decided to look into writing, and I chose to write my first book, We the Presidents, which was issued in January of 2022, which was a presidential history, going back a century, starting with Warren G. Harding, a president, in my opinion, who's significantly underestimated, going all the way through the first presidency of Donald Trump. So 17 presidents over a century. And what I focused on was, first of all, what I did not focus on was politics. The book was very nonpartisan. Not once in the book did I mention the words Democratic or Republican, left or right, liberal or conservative, except in a handful of direct quotes from other people. So what I tried to focus on were the issues and the policies and the decisions that these presidents made that affect America today, and that we still see the echoes of. So, for example, immigration is a major issue today, as you know, we all know. And the issue of immigration really began in the early 1920s. When immigration acts under President Harding and then Calvin Coolidge restricted immigration primarily to Northern Europe and excluded other parts of the world. So I could give you half a dozen examples like that in economics and other areas. So that was a very successful book, which came out in 2022. At that point, I wasn't sure I wanted to write another book, but I had friends that encouraged me to say, Ron, this was about halfway through the COVID pandemic. You ought to think about writing a book about COVID, because there's so much disinformation, misinformation about COVID and the pandemic. With your kind of nonfiction writing style, perhaps you could contribute something. But I was hesitant to do that because, like a lot of people, I think almost everybody, as we were beginning near the end of the COVID pandemic, I mean, we were tired of that. We wanted to look ahead, and we did not want to look back. It was a very painful time, and I resisted those suggestions. But then I did take the time to read a couple of books, and what astonished me was, as you know, the Spanish flu of 1918 was disastrous for the United States. We lost almost 700,000 people. Yeah, 700,000, which was like 4 times more than died, more than 4 times more than died in World War One. Yet very few people before the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, knew much about the 1918 Spanish flu. And it was amazing to me. This is what kind of pushed me over the edge. It was amazing to me that the first book about the 1918 Spanish flu, written for the general population, not a medical text, wasn't written until 50 years later, in the 1970s. And it was the name of the book was The Forgotten Influenza Pandemic, or something very close to that. So it took 50 years to really document that broadly. And I thought, well, perhaps I could do something by trying to write an objective, hopefully an objective, nonpartisan discussion of the pandemic, how people lived through it, starting from the first rumors of the COVID pandemic in China, all the way through the end of 2022, when it was officially over in May of 2023. And so I looked at 3 years of the pandemic and tried to write objectively about the issues during the pandemic. That
Yeah.
was kind of my focus.
So, did you have something in there, or I'm assuming you, with all the stuff you've done with this reading on the Spanish flu, that we could have learned from that would have been more helpful for how we responded during COVID?
Did I? Now the question is, did I learn something writing the book about COVID?
No, should we, the people, the Americans, whatever, the world, have learned something from that Spanish flu that would have been episode that would have been helpful?
Well, I think yes, because it's interesting that there's so many similarities between the Spanish flu and the COVID pandemic. And I actually read Daniel Defoe's book about the London plague of 1665,
Hmm.
which has many similarities. So the similarities, for example, are disinformation, or perhaps more honestly, misinformation, people not knowing what was going on, be developing their own ideas and theories. I won't call them conspiracy theories. They were trying to come up with rationale for what was happening.
Hmm.
People resisted public health measures. For example, many cities mandated face masks during the Spanish flu of 1918, and men would walk around with a hole punched out in their face mask so they could smoke a cigar and inside and protest. We also had during the 1918 Spanish flu, this is well documented, well before the first major books came out. This was documented in the 1920s, where different cities, and two in particular, Philadelphia and St. Louis, practiced very different approaches to managing the 1918 Spanish flu. Philadelphia chose to remain open during September of 1918, when the Surgeon General called for cities to close because it was an air spread disease. So they basically sponsored a Liberty Bonds parade and day, which attracted 200,000 people in Philadelphia. St. Louis resisted that and basically kept the city closed. And of course, the business people were very upset about that. But the difference is that there was a huge difference in death rates. And I can't recall the exact numbers, but there was a difference of about 5-1. So, as I recall, between September and the end of December, I believe within Philadelphia, something like 18,000 people died.
Hmm.
These numbers are not quite accurate, but something in that range. Whereas in St. Louis, less than 3,000 did. That's a 5 to 6-1 difference based on public health policies.
Right.
But they were unpopular, and that's the same thing that happened here. When you look at my book, you'll see the difference in death rates between the states vary from almost by a factor of 5.
Wow.
From the lowest to the highest number of states, Vermont being the lowest, and other states like Mississippi, unfortunately, being the highest.
Wow.
So that was very similar.
I knew there was a difference, but I didn't realize there was anywhere near that big of a difference between different states.
And it's even larger when you look at the county level.
Okay, okay. That actually makes sense. I know where I am here in Washington State, our governor had us shut down for quite a long time, and was hard for many people and many businesses and so on, students and so on and so forth. However, a lot of people really, again, and I want to talk about this too, the political part of it, or just the different belief systems, whatever. There would be stores that would say, you can't come in without a mask, and people would come in without the mask on, just in total defiance, and you can't make me wear the mask, like they're in kindergarten again. But it was really, really interesting to see how some counties where I am had definitely different rates of sickness as well as death from COVID. So yeah, I can see that. So so let's talk a little bit about that. How did things like politics and personal freedom and so on and so forth impact people's mind frame during the pandemic, and what they did or didn't do?
Well, it was kind of counterintuitive. President Trump, one of his greatest achievements was Operation Warp Speed, and that was the project to develop a vaccine in record time. He announced that in May of 2020, and he made a huge political risk when he said, we want to develop a working vaccine by the end of the year. That was like less than 9 months later, and most people, including in public health, thought that was not possible. But that was possible, and they developed 2 successful vaccines. by the end of December. They had been tested thoroughly and were considered to be very safe.
Hmm.
Um, but what was surprising, though, was after that great success, President Trump did not promote vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
And he just chose not to do that for some reason, mainly because I think his base, the Republican base, was skeptical because there had been so much disinformation starting in May
Yep.
of 2020 that the vaccines would be dangerous. He tended to stay away from it. And here's an astonishing statistic. As you know, he communicated with his public and the American public through tweets. And in 2020, he sent out something like 12,000 tweets. 12,000. Just a little more than 100 mention the word vaccine.
Hmm.
100 out of 12,000. And many of those were self-congratulatory, congratulating himself and his administration for record time and Operation Warp Speed, or demonizing Joe Biden for he would not have been able to do that had he been president.
Mm.
So that was a significant failing, I think, what caused people to back away from vaccines, unfortunately, that were basically supporters of Trump, because their feeling was if he's not supporting it, it may not be safe.
Yeah, yeah, and there was a lot of disinformation about different treatments. So was it horse antibiotics or something? And then
Well, that's you're thinking about ivermectin and
yes,
hydroxychloroquine, and the latter. Trump actually said, and President Trump said in May or June, he says, "I'm taking it. I think it works very well. I think it's going to keep people safe." And of course, there was no reason to say that, and the FDA did an emergency analysis of that, and 6 weeks later said, "No, there's no correlation between hydroxychloroquine and improving symptoms or certainly stopping COVID."
right, right.
Yet
Although
people were still taking it.
let's say, but some people will blindly follow no matter what. So that is always, well, surprises me, but there it goes. So how did the U.S. compare to other countries with regard to not just death rate, but response and how they kept their businesses open or didn't, and so on?
Well, unfortunately, if you look at the complete pandemic, the United States did very poorly, which was I found very sad. Um, what I did in my book was I analyzed the 20 largest developed countries, not including China, because we don't have good statistics from China. But I looked at countries ranging from Japan, Germany, Australia, the UK, Canada, 20 developed countries. And of those 20 developed countries, the United States, during that 3 years of the pandemic, had the worst COVID death rate of any of those countries. So about 3,200 deaths per million, which was the highest. Countries like uh, Canada, for example, were in the range, as I recall, of about 1,200, 1,300, well below us. Uh, Germany, this is astonishing. Germany has a median age of about 48 years, so about half the population is older than 48 years and half's younger. Our median age is less than 10 years, is more than 10 years, 37.5. So we're more than 10 years younger than Germany, yet Germany had a death rate half of the United States.
Hmm.
And I attribute that to a large part, I think, to the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, who's become controversial recently. But at the time, she gave a very rare speech to the German people saying, this is going to be very serious. It's the most significant challenge to Germans since the Second World War. And we're going to have to make sacrifices as a community to keep this from killing many Germans. And the Germans followed that advice, and they suffered economically because they had large, not unemployment, because Germany has a policy of full employment, but their GDP suffered. But the death rates were very low compared to the United States, and particularly when you consider the age being so much older than the average American age.
Yeah, I'm actually going to add in there. I think Americans are probably not as healthy as Germans are too. We have so much with obesity and other issues here, health wise, than the American people that I think other countries maybe don't have as much of as well.
Or
So,
no, you're absolutely right about that. I talk about that in my book quite a bit. We have twice the spending per capita of the average developed country, twice the spending. Yet our average lifespan before the COVID pandemic was typically about 4 years uh, uh, less than other developed countries.
mhm.
And our maternal death rate was even worse. In many cases, it's 10 times higher than developed countries. Like Sweden has a maternal death rate that's 1/10 the United States, which is a shame. And it's due to the poor health of Americans, poor health care in certain parts of the country. It's a many factored thing.
And health inequity too also comes into play there with regard to we don't have
Huge differences between states and counties.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. No, and that's a totally different topic in and of itself, a different book in and of itself about what's wrong with our healthcare system. It's maybe a series of books, actually, now that I say that. So, what things, because I think, I don't think I'm the only one that thinks we're going to get another pandemic at some point in time, maybe not in my lifetime, but eventually. What should we have learned from the COVID response, the mistakes, maybe? What should we have learned that maybe we could do better next time?
Well, I would use one word: communications.
Hmm.
I think the largest mistake that happened during the COVID pandemic, we didn't have an authoritative voice that was consistent, speaking to the American public in a way they could understand and trust.
Hmm.
So we were divided as a country. We had cable news, we had social media, we had private physicians, we had physicians and many times advocating countermeasures like ivermectin.
Hmm.
Um, we had all kinds of disinformation, like I said, from social media, and it confused the public. And at the beginning of the pandemic, major cable news channels came out, and their commentators said, this is a political hoax. This has been done by the Democrats to discredit President Trump during an election year." That was well documented. I quote that in my book a number of times. It was just a terrible situation where Americans were horribly confused about what was going on. So the next time, we need one person, ideally in the government, or one group that can speak authoritatively in clear terms on a regular basis, forgetting politics, and just talk to people honestly about what the issues are and answer questions in some manner. We've got great technology now where people have questions, they can be an authoritative source and people can go to them. That did not happen during the pandemic, and that's why we're so divided. That's why some counties have death rates 10 times higher than counties just 100 miles away.
Yeah, and there still is, of course, confusion about, COVID. I mean, there's still people with all kinds of conspiracy theories about, how it started and whatever it was, the market or an escaped virus from a lab and all this kind of stuff. And even with I know many of my students even have shared with me that they don't want to get COVID vaccines. They don't want to get the updated vaccines, even though the medical community, the scientific minded, are saying, yes, you should still get a COVID vaccine like a flu vaccine. So there's still a lot of that out there. Do you attribute that, you think, still to this whole divide, political divide kind of
Yeah, I
thing?
think so.
Yeah.
I think so. And of course, I hear that a lot, having written a book about that, and from also, very, very educated people. They have opinions about this. And what I say to them, I say, look, we're blessed in the United States with we have some of the best medical institutions in the world. We have the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. We have Stanford in California. We have the Cleveland Clinic. We have Massachusetts General in Boston.
Mhm.
Go to their websites and see what they say.
Right, right.
And if you want to do your own research, go to the best institutions, some of the best institutions of the world, and see what they say. And
Yeah.
I suggest you believe what you read there, take it to your personal physician, ask him or her, and 99% of the time, the physician will say, well, if the Mayo Clinic or Stanford believes this is correct, it is correct.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, to your point about communication, I know in the early days of COVID, even in the medical community, people did not know what to do or what to tell people to do. So I'll give you an example. One of the physicians that I've worked with would tell people, "Oh, it's not that big of a deal. It's not, blah 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 blah." Really, really kind of downplayed until he realized that it was a big deal and had to change his tune on that. And it was really just not necessarily misinformed, but he just hadn't looked at the data and thought, well, how bad can this be? He'd never lived through something like this before. So in his career and training as a physician, he's thinking this isn't, really going to be any worse than the flu until people realized that it was.
Yeah. Well, the feeling was that it may have been uh, it's interesting in that the Spanish flu killed many people, but it went out very quickly. It only lasted seriously about 9 months. And the Asian flu in the 50s was the same way. So we thought, many people thought, I think with good credentials, that the COVID would basically disappear within a year. It did not. It lasted over 3 years, and it could have been much longer without the vaccine. So there's a lot of issues that were confusing the people.
Yeah, no, for sure. Actually, I have a acquaintance that just passed away from COVID in March. So I mean, it's
Oh,
still
that's a shame. I'm sorry to hear that.
still out
This
there.
late in
And
the cycle.
yeah, actually, absolutely. It's amazing to me that I still hear stories about that, people getting really, really sick and then passing away, and in his case, he was only 50. So, really kind of one of those things where you think, "Gosh, how is this still happening? How is this still out there in that force, in that form?" So,
Well,
yes,
I think the death rate still is in a range of about 2 to 3,000 people a month are still dying of COVID. At least that was the case a few months ago
here in the US, or is that globally?
in the U.S. In the U.S.
Yeah, and is
Yeah.
that still higher than other countries are?
I haven't checked that I can't say.
I'm curious if they're doing something more proactive there. I
Yeah,
mean,
that's a good question. I should check, and I haven't looked at that in 6 to 9 months, so I don't know what it is in the last few months.
yeah, because I'm doubting anybody's still in any sort of a lockdown. I mean, still in the stores where I am, for example, there's still a tape on the floor for where you're supposed to social distance yourself from the next customer and so on. And maybe they just haven't taken it up, but people still observe that because we were accustomed to it. So, like when I was in line the other day, I stood behind the blue tape and thought, oh wait,
Yeah.
whatever. But it just,
Mhm.
once it gets in your brain, it gets in your brain. Or just, I mean, I remember thinking at the time, I hope people really realize things like hand washing, things that many of us, especially those of us who've worked in healthcare, like, how do you not know that hand washing is what you need to do? And not coughing on people and not getting on an airplane when you're really, really sick when everybody else now is going to get sick. And some of that common sense stuff, I kind of had hoped would get into the brains of people. And maybe it has, and I just am not noticing it as much. But I kind of wondered about that.
Mhm.
But yeah, so as I mentioned, we will put a link to your book in in the podcast notes so that people can find it. It sounds absolutely fascinating. I definitely want to read it myself because I'm just the whole topic of how we responded and didn't respond is amazing. I don't know if you probably heard of the author Malcolm Gladwell, but in his last book, The Tipping Point Part 2,
Uh-huh.
he does talk about the COVID pandemic and super spreaders and different events where companies just said, no big deal, and had all these huge numbers of people, and of course everybody getting sick and so on. And it's like, how did we not learn from even those earlier days to not continue to do
Well,
that?
I'll have to look for that because I love Malcolm Gladwell, and
Yeah.
I'll look for that latest book. I haven't seen that yet.
Yep, I just devour his work. But yes, it's the latest one. I guess it's the follow-up to his very first book, which was The Tipping
Uh-huh.
Point. But he talks about COVID in there, and it's really I'm thinking of that as I'm talking to you. It's kind of, yeah, he was talking into the same sort of things. But we will do that. Is there anything you'd like to share with us before we end today?
No, I think you've asked awesome, really relevant, very great questions. So, the bottom line is, if this ever comes up again and we're part of it, go to people you trust, and those are going to be the best institutions in the country. I think those are trustworthy. They've got a track record. Trust them.
Yeah.
Don't listen to disinformation on the web or even cable news.
Stay off social media. Don't get your news from Instagram, whatever. It's just like or somebody's
That is so true.
blog. Don't even look at my blog. Go to the real that sort of thing. So I appreciate that. Well, thank you, Ron, so much for your time today.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I enjoyed chatting with you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Good Grief. We hope that stories shared today have inspired and empowered you on your own journey of resilience. If you want to dive deeper into the themes of trauma, tragedy, and survival, be sure to check out my memoir, The Day I Became the Spider Killer, a memoir of trauma, tragedy, and survival. In this book, I shared my own raw and honest experiences, offering insights and strategies for overcoming life's toughest challenges. You can purchase the book on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or listen to it on Audible. Your support helps us continue to bring these powerful stories to light and spread a message of hope and resilience. Stay tuned for more incredible stories on our next episode. Until then, remember, even in the face of life's toughest trials, there can be light, growth, and good grief.